For those of you expecting Cadet Fitzpatrick's big interview with Jim Gavin right now on this channel, the studio was ready and the slot was his. And we did reach out to his team last night, regardless of the decision, but it wasn't to be. I am joined by Fianna Fáil Minister of State Niall Collins, People Before Profit Solidarity TD Paul Murphy, Ireland editor with the Irish Independent Fionnán Sheahan, and commentator Alison O'Connor. You can send us your comments as well. Did Micheál Martin shoot himself in the foot by his backing of Jim Gavin? Simply scan the QR code or contact us via the WhatsApp number. Before any of that, we're going to hear from Fianna Fáil MEP Billy Kelleher, the man who ran against Jim Gavin to secure the Fianna Fáil nomination. Billy, what questions does all of this raise for your party?
Well, I think it raises the whole issue around transparency when it comes to selecting candidates for big elections like the presidential campaign itself. I mean, we have to accept that this is a campaign like no other in terms of the scrutiny that's placed on every candidate. It is a very brutal campaign. You need to be a campaigner for this type of election. So I think from my perspective, what we have to try and ascertain is, what lengths did the party go to in terms of robustly interrogating the various candidates that were being looked at from the point of view of headquarters and the leadership. And then ultimately, I believe that we should have had a more definitive internal discussion with regard to candidates coming before the parliamentary party, being asked questions, being scrutinised, and also going through a due diligence process as well. Clearly, none of that really happened in this context. There wasn't going to be really an election until I issued a statement on the 19th of August. It would have been effectively Jim Gavin conferred to the parliamentary party by the leadership. And I don't think that's healthy for democracy, particularly for a party like Fianna Fáil that has given great service, has been involved in election campaigns since 1926. And now we find ourselves without a candidate in a presidential election after we selecting one.
Despite the fact that there was a contest after you submitted your own name, do you feel you got a fair go of it within the party?
Well, look, I mean, I'm a Fianna Fáil person and I'm a Democrat, so I accept the outcome. But I mean, I think the decisions, and the discussion around the selection of the candidates in the parliamentary party was more of an enforced decision on the parliamentary party rather than an informed decision. In other words,
enforced by who, Billy?
Well, I mean, there was almost a predetermined outcome to it. I mean, we did campaign, we tried to engage with as many TDs as possible, but I just think that having a preordained view of one candidate over another in advance of they making their positions clear to the parliamentary party before they'd have an opportunity to speak with the members of the parliamentary party, that there was almost a predetermined outcome to that particular process. But
in
my view,
again,
is not healthy for democracy.
Predetermined by whom? By Micheál Martin on his own? By Micheál Martin and Jack Chambers, or other people as well?
Well, I'm not sure, but I mean, I know full well that there was a lot of phone calls made in advance of the meeting where I presented my credentials and where Jim Gavin very ably presented his credentials as well. Let's be very clear. But I mean, there was a view, there was a lot of phone calls made. And I just think that in the context of the parliamentary party being the final adjudicating body, that the very least that should happen is there would be an open, transparent discussion with the parliamentary party. There'd be engagement, there'd be hustings, there'd be questions, there'd be answers, and there would be that robust interrogation by the party members themselves in advance of they finally making a decision. And that didn't really happen. In fact, I don't think it would have happened at all, only for I entering the race and we starting a campaign to try and get some debate going in the party around what the presidency means to Fianna Fáil, what it means to the country, and how a person would campaign in terms of delivering that message to the broader public during a very intense campaign, which we know presidential elections are.
Billy Kelleher, thanks a million for that. Fionnán Sheahan, catch us up on what the latest is in terms of exactly who knew what and when within the Fianna Fáil parliamentary party and senior leadership within that party when it comes to Jim Gavin and this unpaid rent refund.
Yeah, well, the Fianna Fáil leadership, as we call them, because that is basically Micheál Martin and Jack Chambers, are claiming they knew nothing until this weekend, that they carried out due diligence. We don't know what that means. And that they did put questions to him about issues and that he didn't provide them with any answers. And then they're claiming that he provided them with effectively incorrect information before the weekend, which they turned out, they then subsequently realised was wrong. And you're kind of looking at, lads, would you give us a break? there was no vetting done of this candidate. There was no due diligence. There was no assessment of his ability to run in this election. And I actually feel sorry for the man at this stage. The manner in which he was treated today was despicable. The way in which he was repeatedly thrown under the bus by Jack Chambers early this morning, Micheál Martin this evening, was quite unedifying. For a pair of guys who brought this guy into the political domain, basically told him, you come in, you run for us, we'll look after you, we'll pay for your campaign, we'll run it. And then to basically put him in probably the single worst organised campaign that the party has ever had. No director of elections involved.
But he's been ultimately undone by something of his own making, though, hasn't he?
He has, but I mean, ultimately, he has had a lot of accomplishments in his life. He's an impressive CV, but I don't think the CV necessarily matches the job that was on offer here. They seem to want a high-profile celebrity candidate because they didn't want Bertie Ahern, they didn't want Billy Kelleher, they didn't want anybody else running. So they latched on to Jim Gavin, thinking there was a bit of stardust here. But you'd have to question, did they actually talk through the ramifications of running for office? Did they actually go through policy positions, the extremes that he would have to go through in order to get elected? And the answer, you'd have to say, is no. And ultimately, there was no loyalty. There was nobody to look out for Jim Gavin, you'd have to say, over the past weekend. Yes, this was his fault. These were his actions. He has to take responsibility for them. He still has to do so. But that doesn't excuse just utterly dumping on the man like they did today.
Did they utterly dump on him, Niall?
Well, it's all very disappointing. Like, we really wanted to run a candidate in the presidential election. We hadn't run a candidate in 28 years. The party membership, the parliamentary party, was very up for this. And, we find ourselves now right in the middle of the campaign where our candidate has withdrawn for all of the reasons that we know. So it's hugely disappointing from that point of view. I certainly, and I've said this earlier on today, I think we need to have a really thorough and in-depth review into all of this. From start to finish, there's a lot of unanswered questions out there in relation to, a chronology of events that Fionnán has outlined, and I think he's owed an explanation. The party has to give an absolutely proper, coherent explanation in relation to that. But look, at the end of the day, it's also a Fianna Fáil issue. This isn't a national issue. It's not a national scandal. It's something that we will have to deal with as a political party. Micheál Martin is the leader of the party, and he'll absolutely...
Well, it has national implications, doesn't it? I mean, we've lost 33% of the field in the presidential election.
Look, there's a process there, and we could have a very long discussion about the whole nomination process of people getting themselves onto the ballot paper for the presidential election. There's still an election on. People have a choice. People got themselves onto the ballot paper. Jim Gavin has decided he's not going to contest anymore, and he's made that absolutely known publicly today. So we just have to get on with it. Micheál Martin is the head of government. We have a budget. It's budget week. The public out there they look at politics and they observe politics, but outside of the political bubble, people have to get up every day. They've got to go to work.
On that,
their families.
Micheál Martin is head of government. Fianna Fáil's the largest party in government, largest party in local government.
Correct, yeah.
And we knew this election was happening, and we knew within a few weeks when it was happening for the last 7 years.
Yeah.
So what then is the response to the charge from Fionnán again that this was just an utterly unprofessional campaign from start to finish?
Yeah, look, there's huge challenges around a presidential campaign, and you could look at the campaigns of the other two people who were in the race, and you could find lots of criticisms in relation.
But leaving gates open and the white trousers and the drone flying and the defence forces clapping, like Jim Gavin got it in the neck for all of those things, but Jim Gavin wasn't running his social media account.
Yeah,
someone in Fianna Fáil was, or someone Fianna Fáil contracted was. They were all Fianna Fáil gaffes.
In my opinion, all those were just nonsense issues. Like that was the Twitter bubble. Kind of looking at all that kind of stuff. They weren't issues of substance. And look. All campaigns make mistakes. They'll never, nothing will ever run seamlessly, and there'll be plenty of people out there, detractors. It's, You know, it's a contest, it's a political contest. You know, people will get the kitchen sink thrown at them.
But would you accept you lads were making a lot more mistakes than the other two?
Yeah, and there was a lot of nefarious kind of stuff, you know, bogus, not true stuff, untrue, you know, rumours and innuendo stuff spread online, and, you know, that was thrown out there in relation to Jim Gavin, which wasn't. And you got to remember at the back of all this, you know, there's Jim Gavin, the person, there's his family, there's also the guy who was owed back the rent money. You know, people have to think about him too. You know, he's been left hanging for a long time in relation to this, and I think that needs to be dealt with. I'll be very clear in saying that. So I think as a political party, as the Fianna Fáil party, we're very, very disappointed. Our councillors, our membership are very, very disappointed. I think we fundamentally, at a bare minimum, we have to have a review into where all this went wrong. We also have to have a structural change within our party structures in terms of allowing our membership, our active membership, and our councillors an input into how we select our presidential candidates. And maybe, you know, there's a bit of a legacy there, but the fact that we haven't contested the presidential election in 28 years, the focus wasn't on it. We had a review of our 2020 general election performance, which was conducted by Sean Fleming. We haven't yet commissioned or structured a review of the last general election, where we did quite well. As you said, we're the largest party in Parliament and in local government. So there's a lot of positives there. So, you know, it's got to be taken in context. You know, the people out there are what's important. This is a Fianna Fáil, an internal Fianna Fáil issue. Budget this week, we have to, you know, sell the budget to people, explain to them how we're going to.
We will talk about the budget as well a little bit later. Paul, is this an internal Fianna Fáil issue?
I mean, I think a large part of it is an internal Fianna Fáil issue. It obviously has, you know, national repercussions. This is unprecedented to have a candidate drop out in a presidential election, turning a three-horse race into a two-horse race. I do, on a personal level, have sympathy for Jim Gavin. I'm sure it was a very, very bruising experience for him and his family. But also, I would very much agree with what Niall was saying there, that there is an issue outstanding here, which is that tenants paid rent that was not owed, asked for it back, sent a solicitor's letter 16 years ago, have still not been repaid. And if one good thing comes out of this is that, I presume in the next number of days, these tenants are finally going to get their money back. I think an issue for Fianna Fáil is, when did Fianna Fáil become aware of this issue, as opposed to a general issue about vetting? So what we're currently, the current story is they're asked on Friday, they say no, then they find out on Saturday that, oh, there's substance to this. So
had you heard anything about this before Friday?
I hadn't, but I have since been told that contact was made with Fianna Fáil early in September on this issue, effectively looking for the money back. The money wasn't forthcoming, and now we've gotten to this point. And I suspect that attention will focus on that in the coming days. Because if that's the case,
I know you,
well, then that
you
poses
heard one of your colleagues in Fianna Fáil speaking to me when we were speaking on the radio earlier as well, who said on the 12th of September he heard about this.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a relevant point, and it was discussed on, you and I were on News Talk radio earlier this evening. And again, that's something that the party is going to have to, you know, consider and have examined when we do a thorough review into this whole how this whole thing has ended up where.
But the timeline doesn't really stand up to any scrutiny, doesn't it? That Fionnán breaks the story on Friday, and that it's presented to Jim Gavin, and it doesn't ring a bell.
Yeah, look.
Do you know what I mean? Yeah. It's one thing to, like, as Micheál Martin said, that it's filed away in the deep recesses of his mind. But surely, given the detail of Fionnán's story, when he sees it, that's going to ring a bell. And then, lo and behold, by Sunday, when there's documentary evidence to back it up, suddenly, God, you know what? That does mean something to me now.
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of taken us for fools, isn't it?
And listen, I'm not here to try and defend that or to explain that.
But you didn't believe that, then,
I want
did you?
I want to hear an explanation. You know, I want to hear a coherent explanation. And
it sounds like you don't actually believe that.
Well, look, I mean, it doesn't stack up. You know, it just didn't stack up. And Fionnán is entitled to, and his readers, and by extension, everybody, you know, the public are entitled to, people who are interested in this are entitled to an absolute coherent explanation from Fianna Fáil as to how Fionnán, you know, put in a media query, which he's perfectly entitled to do, doing his job, and was given an incorrect answer, if I can describe it like that.
Fionnán, how do you feel about getting that incorrect answer?
I'm glad to hear Niall is the first person in Fianna Fáil to have said that to me, because nobody contacted me in Fianna Fáil over the weekend and said, well, sorry, now we gave you and your readers, the public at large, incorrect information here. We'd like to acknowledge that, and we'd like to correct that record. The first I learned that Jim Gavin's story was shifting was when I was watching the second TV debate. I mean, ultimately, Niall says it's not a national issue. Well, there are national implications here. If the public cannot trust the biggest political party in the country to actually take serious media queries seriously, where they're given a substantial level of detail, and they release a statement, which was a Fianna Fáil statement on Friday night, like the one that they did, which was inaccurate, it was selective, and it deliberately avoided particular questions. And I can only draw the conclusion from looking at that statement that that was in an effort to put us off from running the story, because it was basically trying to say, no, you haven't got it right here, lads, because he doesn't know anything about this, he doesn't remember it, and he's checked his records and he doesn't know anything about it. So that's the only conclusion that I can draw. So we can have a whole lot of debates about, oh, there's misinformation out there, it's all social media's fault and so on and so forth. Whenever I put queries to political parties, you'd be amazed at the amount of answers you get back that are nothing related to the truth. Delay, deny, distract. And it's not just Fianna Fáil, it's with Sinn Féin a year ago, it's with Fine Gael earlier on this year. You saw the saga with the fellow in the Social Democrats. It is a constant problem that basically every story that you're looking into in this country, you basically have to be second-guessing yourself and be doubly sure that you're right, because if it's going to a political party, you're just going to get a denial.
Alison, is Micheál Martin damaged by all of this?
He's undeniably damaged by all of this. I mean, we started off with Billy Kelleher, who's more than entitled to his Schadenfreude. I've heard Niall a couple of times today, and he's obviously been sent out, and I don't think there's a queue of people to come out. He reminds me of somebody sort of doing an impression standing on a motorway with a 5-car pile-up behind him, and he's sort of saying nothing to see here, but maybe they'd wear their seatbelts the next time they're heading out. It's an unmitigated mess, the whole thing. And I'm thinking back to Jim Gavin's launch last Sunday week and being there and seeing his family, his wife, his kids, his mother was there. And it's tough. Politics is tough. And I completely agree with Fionnán that Fianna Fáil, and by the way, it was a cracker, journalistically, a cracker of a story, that Fianna Fáil, made a dog's dinner of so many aspects of the campaign. But where I might diverge is that this issue of due diligence, and that if you're saying to somebody, were you a landlord? Did you have issues with tenants? And I too heard that conversation you had with Paddy O'Sullivan today, where he said he got a text from somebody in another party. And if that person keeps saying to you, no, nothing to say here, like, does a political party, like, say, you have to say to candidates in the future, you don't mind if we put in a private investigator on, everything that happened in your life for the last 20, 25 years? That there is an element of what do you do with that sort of an answer? And I mean, yesterday, having watched the debate on RTE, even apart at all from this issue, I found myself thinking, I don't know, is Jim Gavin going to get to the end of this race? It was turning out to be the worst idea that ever happened. You asked me whether Micheál Martin is damaged. He is undoubtedly, and listening to him on the 6 o'clock news, the 6-1 news earlier, I didn't get a sense of a lot of contrition from him, really, where he was kind of saying, well, a lot of other people supported him as well. And that nobody was putting themselves forward, nobody else was putting themselves...
This is kind of success as a thousand fathers, failures and orphans, turned on its head.
I think he's going to find that if you... Like, Micheál Martin has been remarkably successful during his tenure as leader of Fianna Fáil, but has never, quite remarkably, had a good relationship with a lot of sections of his party, and he's kept them in the dark. But one of these days soon, and I think this has hastened that, he's going to find that the mushrooms will jump up and bite you, in the behind. And I think that is definitely... I know he says he will, lead the party into the next election. And what else would he say? Because it would weaken him further to say that, but to say anything different.
Yeah.
But, he has made it his style of leadership not to consult, not to make people feel involved. And I think that middle rump of the party that maybe might not have liked that, but who would have supported him and could see that, you know, the successes that he'd had and that he was Taoiseach in that, I think a lot of them now in the last 24 hours, their minds will have been changed.
Niall, if the timeline is untenable, is Micheál Martin's claim in the 6-1 that he's absolutely leading Fianna Fáil into the next election equally untenable?
Well, look, I mean, Micheál Martin would be the first to put his hand up and take his share of the responsibility in relation to this. And he is a leader, but by any
It's a
yardstick...
small share, though, is how he sees it.
But in fairness, by any yardstick, he's a very substantial politician.
141st is how we might describe it.
Look, he's a hugely substantial politician. He's led us since 2010 when we were in a very, very bad space as a political party. We're now, as we've already said, largest in the Dáil, in the Seanad, at local government. We're the largest party in government. So he has brought us back from a place, from a bad place politically. He's a brilliant man on the international stage. He's got a very detailed handle on domestic affairs. Obviously, he's in politics a long, long time. So it's not his... You know, it's not his best day. It's not our best day as a Fianna Fáil party. But look, as I said to you, it's a Fianna Fáil party issue. The bigger issue out there is the public and the country.
No, it affects us all. Anyone who intended on voting.
I understand
and
that.
Goes and we're probably going to see. We are going to see the three names that they will not. We do not have a choice now of three people. It's a two-woman race, as it happens. And so it intrinsically affects everybody. And I'm sure, I mean, it's worth saying, and I'm sure Paul is very pleased about this, while we're having this conversation, we're looking at social media postings of Catherine Connolly doing really impressive keepy-uppies with the ball and playing basketball with a bunch of kids, you know what I mean? And certainly her momentum is on the up.